Okay, our final talk on dams in this series is Dams in China, and it will be presented by Thomas O'Keefe. Thomas O'Keefe is a river ecologist who has spent his life as a research scientist, restoration ecologist, teacher, policy professional, explorer, and advocate for public enjoyment of rivers. He has a B.S. in ecology from Cornell University and a Ph.D. in aquatic ecology from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He was a research scientist at Tokyo University and participated in the National Science Foundation's Visiting Scholars Program in China and Taiwan. He was also formerly a research coordinator and lecturer at the University of Washington, where his work focused on watershed ecology and specifically the dynamics of large floodplain rivers. Dr. O'Keefe's current work is focused on public policy as it relates to hydropower licensing and federal management of public lands and waters. He represents American Whitewater, a national river conservation organization, and serves as the steering committee of the Hydropower Reform Coalition. He spent significant time exploring rivers, and in 2003, he completed a final descent of the three gorges on China's Yangtze River just months before the filling of the reservoir behind the Three Gorges Dam. Please join me in welcoming Thomas O'Keefe.
Thank you. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and like Josh, my life has taken a rather circuitous course, but along the way it's always involved playing in the water, hanging out on rivers, and and thinking about how we relate to these places, and just my own life, working as a scientist and currently as a policy professional working in the field of hydropower and regulated rivers. I just think back to a lot of the experiences I had as a child connecting with the natural world, and the experiences I had in school developing my critical thinking skills, and just how those have served me in the discussions I'm engaged in today in places like, going back to Washington, D.C., and talking about some of these issues. A lot of what I'm involved in is hydropolicy here in the United States, but I've spent time in China and Japan and have been an observer of a lot of things happening there, and there's some very interesting parallels there too with some of the historical water development that's happened in this country. And I know there was a handout passed out at lunch that I put together the other day that is kind of just a brainstorming exercise that I engaged in, thinking about some of the types of critical, thought-provoking questions that relate to some of the things I'm going to talk about today. So basically, the talk today, I'm going to divide it up into two parts here. The first part is I just want to provide a little bit of context for the Yangtze River, the Three Gorges Project, and how that relates to water development in China generally, and that the significance of this project in the context of things going on throughout the country. And then the second half here, I'm just going to present some images and a story for a personal journey that I took exploring this river here a couple of years ago. So there are approximately 40,000 large dams around the world, holding back approximately half of the accessible runoff. And this is on a flight that I took in China a few years ago, and speaks to the fact that approximately half of those large dams are in China, approximately 20,000 dams. So a lot of places that river systems in the country are significantly regulated and diverted. This is the Three Gorges here, between these two areas here. Here in the center of China, we have the Sichuan Basin. And what I think is really interesting about this figure, and I have a couple of questions that I put together thinking about the geology here, is you have the Indian plate here colliding with the Eurasian plate at a rate of approximately 2 centimeters a year currently, and has resulted in this incredible compression of several river systems here that flow off the Tibetan Plateau. And the Yangtze is one of those river systems that currently would have drained to the south, but is now empties into the Sichuan Basin and has carved this course through the three gorges. Now, the project, the Three Gorges Dam project, is somewhat unique in large dam projects around the world. Many projects attempt to achieve more than one objective, but there are very few that go to the extent that this project does to achieve four different objectives. The first is hydropower, the second is navigation, third is water storage, and the fourth is flood control. Because designing a dam facility often involves various trade-offs in being able to reach different objectives, and having a project that attempts to meet all these objectives is relatively challenging, but I'm going to touch on these. First of all is hydropower, and this facility is currently the largest hydropower facility in the world. Produces a tremendous amount of electricity, approximately 4 times the size of Grand Coulee, the largest facility in this country. One of the things I like to touch on here, the previous speaker sort of referenced how things are portrayed in the media, and I see this a lot not only with this project but with things in the United States as well, talking about hydropower as replacement for other forms of energy. And I think it's useful to put this in the context of what the other forms of energy are and where they're coming from. And what you can see is this dramatic increase in electricity production. The red line there, predominantly coal energy, continues to increase, as does hydropower, which is the blue line. So I think it's important to think critically about this. Is a project like this really replacing other forms of energy, or is it just part of the addition and growth of energy? And it's something that you see around the world. And I think it's also useful to look at energy consumption, comparing our country there, China significantly lower, and think about what this means in terms of the previous figure, as that growth continues to increase. One thing I mentioned, when that project was originally construction was initiated, it was thought to be able to produce 10% of China's electricity needs, and that's currently down to about 3%. The second purpose of this project was navigation, and this river has a very long history of its importance for navigation. It's been a key economic area traditionally for the traditional products that were transported along the river, primarily rice, salt, silk, tea, and tung oil. And more recently, that Sichuan Basin is a center of industry, and one of the significant purposes of this project was the development of an inland seaport there. This is a photograph from Life magazine back in the 1950s. You can see for centuries this was the method of navigation along this river, boats traveling downstream, then being brought back upstream. And despite the advent of steamers in the earliest 20th century, the rapids and the hazards along this river for navigation made it very challenging for all but this type of navigation up until relatively recently. And this is actually in one of the gorges there, just a few months before the gates on the dam were closed. and that's my companion Devin there when we're on our kayak trip down the river exploring this place. But a significant corridor of transportation for modern commerce, and construction of this dam further has enhanced the ability of this river corridor to serve as a conduit for trade and commerce. This is one of my favorite photos that from National Geographic a couple of years ago. It's one of the few photos that I find that sort of captures the immense scale of this thing. This is simply the excavation for the ship locks that were, just kind of on one side of the dam there, and it just gives you a sense of the somewhat of the scale of the project when you consider that this is just one little corner of the construction site there. The third purpose for this project was water storage, and one of the things with China, as was articulated in some of the earlier talks, is just the fact that we have available water resources that are not necessarily matched spatially or temporally to human needs. And if you look at contemporary population relative to water stress, this figure that was published in Science here a couple of years ago, and you look at China here, you have this this area in South China here, fed by the Yangtze River, relative water abundance relative to northern China. And there was this very interesting book published a few years ago now by Lester Brown, Who Will Feed China, where he explores this question of agricultural production in China, looking at just increasing demand for food and grain production, particularly as diet shifts, more meat in the diet, shift to greater demand for water to fuel that production, the challenges of agricultural lands that are converted and developed, and just what this means in terms of increasing water stresses. And I know when I've traveled there and interacting with scientists there, there's been a lot of focus on sort of responding to this, the questions that Lester Brown has raised. Let's see. It looks like my oh, there it is. Okay, and this figure here just illustrates some of this virtual water trade that Lester Brown speaks to, where you have these areas of water deficit and transfer of grains and agricultural products around the globe, and just how we're interrelated through a water trade, through this virtual water trade. So here, we have this agricultural landscape that's been modified over thousands of years of history, and being able to supply water to increase to respond to increased demand is a challenge that this project is in part designed to address. And here, currently underway, there's the three gorges there. Here's the Yangtze River, starts up here, comes down this way into the Sichuan Basin, out to Shanghai there. There's a massive project underway to divert water from the south to the north, an eastern route, a central route, and currently work is initiated on a western route as well. And then flood control. So, another purpose of this project is to provide flood storage capacity to take the what were 10-year flood events that were coming out of this river basin and provide some storage to capture some of those peak flow events in the spring. Okay, so those are so that's just a little bit of an overview of this project, some of the reasons that it was constructed, and then I just wanted to share some stories from a journey that I took down the river here a couple of years ago now, and we took this overnight ferry up the river, assembled our kayaks there on the banks of the river, and set off on this journey. One of the things I touched on, I have a couple of questions, thoughts about this in the materials that I provided, but a very rich cultural history along this river. And as we were traveling down the river in those last month, there was just this scurry of activity as people were running around trying to capture and document some elements of that cultural history that was along the river. And here near the entrance to the Three Gorges, carvings, inscriptions in the rocks that'll soon be buried. This is the entrance to the first of the Three Gorges here, a very iconic site, both in Chinese history. Appears on the currents on one of the banknotes. This entrance to the Three Gorges, and again. Just all along this river, as we're traveling downstream, witness to the rich cultural history of this place. These were some folks that we encountered along the river, some orange farmers tending to their orange grove or checking on their orange grove that was along the rivers, the owners of that plantation. Very interesting experience there, thinking about, just the transformation in terms of, the agricultural, activity that occurred along this river corridor. And this here is the first of the Three Gorges there, from up on the edge of that orange plantation. One of the fascinating things about this journey down this river, truly one of the great. I've traveled a lot of places around the world and would consider this one of the great river journeys in the world. What's very fascinating about this place, a place where, one watershed where approximately 10% of the world's population lives, and just what was very interesting is in this place where the annual fluctuations in the river with the late spring, early summer high flows would come and deposit these sandy beaches, and the fact that precluded any sort of development right along the river, made for just great places to camp and interface with the river. And it was just very interesting too, though, despite the what would seem to be the remoteness of some of these areas along the river, just the intensity of human settlement up along the gorges, and just the fact that every day when we'd set up our camp, we were immediately joined by someone who would quickly become our friend. Very interesting contrast here with the industrial development of the waterway, but the continued use of this place for fishing and for activities that were occurring along the river, activities that will, have changed significantly with the construction of the facility there. This is Wushan. It's the major city in the Three Gorges, and when we were there, as you can see here, most of the old city there, soon to be inundated, has largely been demolished. Few people, still living along the banks of the river here, and the new city starting to take shape here up along the edge of the new reservoir. And here you just sort of see this transformation that's occurred here. The Dawning River, which is a major tributary here that comes in at Wushan, the old city as it appeared back in 1997, and then you can see basically looking that same view down there in 2003. The interesting thing too is also just not only the development of these cities and the relocation associated with that, but in addition to the hydroelectric project itself and the development of the waterway for industrial commerce, there's also, you can see a new bridge taking shape here, one of several that were along this river that we encountered along our journey, and the development of a new highway and transportation infrastructure was also taking place. And here's taking a look at some of the deconstruction happening in Wushan there. We spent a couple of days on this trip, disassembled our boats, went up onto the Dawning River here, major tributary. A ferry boat here was transporting folks back and forth across the river. Just a incredible place, these gorges on the Dawning River. We did manage to get ourselves into a little bit of trouble on this trip. We learned that kayaks were not appreciated by the local boatmen, and we were promptly escorted off the river. So that was our one encounter with the authorities. As one of my friends who does trips overseas, we were kind of operating in the gray zone. We just kind of just the two of us just went over and just decided to do this without going through any official permissions or anything. This is the entrance to the second gorge there, downstream of Wushan. Here you can see some of that the tracker paths that have been were carved into the rocks, now inundated by the reservoir. Illustrated by that earlier photo that I showed from life, where boats were actually pulled upstream, and places where steps had been carved as part of that pathway along the river. And then places like this, an old winch station that was used to help with pulling those boats upstream through the rapids, had been replaced by mechanical winching stations that were in places along the river, of course, all now inundated and unnecessary due to the fact that there's a reservoir now. One of our sort of more favorite characters that we encountered along the river, this boat builder, a man in his 90s who had been building boats his whole life along the river. He invited us into his hut, and we spent an enjoyable afternoon with him. And then the last of the three gorges here, the third one, just a fascinating landscape. These walls, just disappearing up into the mist and the clouds. So that concludes our journey down the river, and like I said, I've got some questions that I put together for just thinking about ways that students might think about what's happening in not only in China but also in India and Bolivia and the Middle East and these other places around the world where there's this tremendous drive towards development of projects like this designed to meet very basic societal needs, but at what cost do those come? And then I think about my own work that I do in this country, not only related to policy of existing facilities, but removal of dams and other facilities that have outlived their useful life, and how we determine when that is, and how we might factor that in to our decisions and discussions about these places. And I think it's it's very interesting when we talk about places like this to really think about our own communities and how we connect to communities that we live in. And I often challenge folks when I'm talking about this stuff or teaching to think about where does your electricity come from? Where does your water come from? And I think there are some very good ways that you can think about connecting the questions and policy decisions that places like this are facing to our own world and our own experiences. So thanks. So that's what I have prepared. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.